right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mike Frazier. I am a former high school English teacher and a current PhD student in learning technologies at Ohio State University. Through the Writing Across the Curriculum program, I also help to coach the teaching of writing here at Ohio State. So it's been an interesting ride these past several months with all the things happening with generative AI. But one of the things that I've always tried to do as an instructor is try as much as possible to personalize learning for my students, because that's the most effective way, I think, to learn. So with all of the things happening with ChatGPT and generative AI in the past several months, and like every day it's a new thing. It's some days I'm just like, I can't even read the news today. And so I for this session, I really want to focus on like one single entry point as an example for ChatGPT. And the best way to learn about how to use it is to use it. And when I first heard about it, I was reading an article. I found an article about like the death of the high school English essay. And then later there was one about the death of the college essay. And I was like, oh, geez. So I pulled up ChatGPT and I was like, okay, what's this thing? What can it do for me? And I started testing it out and looking around, seeing what it could do. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. I think it could do some things for me, but I'm a teacher at heart. So I wanted to know, what can this thing do for my students? And so I wanted to get back to that personalization aspect. So I asked ChatGPT yesterday, and this was the GPT-4 version to be clear, what are the primary aspects of an effective ChatGPT prompt that would help a user identify an effective and personalized analogy to understand a difficult concept? I got this idea because I teach an undergraduate course in learning and motivation strategies, and we were talking about the information processing theory model. And a traditional activity I had those students do was work in groups to come up with an analogy for the information processing theory model. And this past spring, we had been talking about ChatGPT and using it. And one of the groups said, okay, well, yeah, Mike, we came up with an analogy. Well, ChatGPT helped us come up with this analogy. We wanted a sports analogy because we're all into sports. And so it came up with this analogy about, football, and like, okay, so the quarterback starts with the sensory input, right? He's, doing whatever quarterbacks do with their hands and eyes and whatever. He gets the ball, right? And then he's scanning, right? Working memory. He's looking at the field and what's going on. And then he throws the ball. The wide receiver catches it, or whoever. It's stored in long-term memory, touchdown. And that was the end of ChatGPT's analogy. And I was like, well, hold on a second. That's not all of the information processing theory model, right? Because you have to retrieve that information later, right? Back to your working memory. So how does the quarterback get the ball back? And he's like, oh, well, that's a good point. So I said, okay, let's go back to ChatGPT. Ask ChatGPT, what are the limitations of the analogy that you just gave me? And it gave us a list, and that was one of the things that it missed that part, which I thought was really interesting. And so that's led to all of this that you're about to see. So this is what I asked ChatGPT yesterday. And these are the answers that it gave me immediately. And all of these look pretty good to me based on my experience using ChatGPT and researching it for pretty much every day for the past several months. The first thing is, the higher quality your inputs are, the higher quality the outputs are going to be. So one way to ensure that is to be specific. So the more specific your request is, the better the AI's response will be. So instead of asking something like, what is quantum physics? You could get more specific. Can you explain quantum entanglement, specific concept within there, using a music-related analogy if you're into music? Give it some more context. So along with both of these here, the more constraints you're able to give the AI, the higher quality the outputs are going to be. So give it some context. If you have an interest, a specific interest or a hobby, you can ask it to include that. So I love baking. Can you explain the concept of blockchain using a baking related analogy? Another thing you can do is tell it what you know already, or tell it, the areas that you don't totally understand yet that you need help with. If you're a complete beginner, I don't know anything about coding, right? Can you explain Python programming and how it works using a gardening analogy? It can do that. If you know some, you can tell it what you know and then what you still want to know, and that can be helpful too. And then if if you ask it to explain something and you're like, this doesn't make any sense, then you can ask for a clarifying question, right? That doesn't quite make sense to me. Can you explain it to me as if I were, a fifth grader or a high schooler, right? Or an undergraduate student, or someone who doesn't know anything about coding, right? So it's an iterative process. And this leads to our next one, breaking down complex concepts. So number 4 and number 5 here are related to a concept called prompt chaining, a prompt chaining technique. And there was a study done, and this is available, I think, in OpenAI's GPT-4 API documentation. There was a research study done that found if you give ChatGPT a really complex problem in one single prompt, its accuracy rates in the output and solving that prompt are about 16, 17%, something like that. I think it was like less than 20. And then if you break it down into multiple prompts by chaining your prompts or ask it to break it down into multiple steps, the accuracy in it solving that complex problem went up to like 96, 97%. So break it down. The more you can break it down for the AI, the more likely it will be to give you an accurate answer. Asking open-ended questions, telling it to use creativity, whatever that means for an AI, or to make assumptions if you need to, things like that. How would you describe the concept of neural networks to a child using a story about animals? It's likely to give you a pretty good answer. And I will note also that I found that this one probably works a little bit better for GPT-4 than GPT 3.5. And then another thing that GPT-4 does a little bit better is knowing that you're probably going to want an example of this whole list that it just gave you. 3.5 tends to not do this unless you prompt it, right? So I'd have to probably, this is probably what GPT 3.5 would give me. And then I would say, okay, can you give me an example now of an effective prompt? But 4.0 just went ahead and did that for me. I'm a medical student and I love basketball. I'm having a hard time understanding the Krebs cycle. Could you explain it to me as if it's a basketball game? So there's a good example. You could try that out. And so now that we have some understandings of what ChatGPT thinks would be an effective ChatGPT prompt for this particular task, let's give it a try. If you are able to, if you have access to ChatGPT, you can go ahead and open it up. If you don't, you can sign up for a free account or log in for free with your Google account, or I think there's probably another option too. And so the first thing here to sort of like simple point of entry, identify a difficult concept within your field, maybe that students tend to struggle with a lot. And then just start using, test it out, right? Start using ChatGPT to develop and iterate your own prompt that you might be able to say, hey, and give it to your students and say, hey, plug in, an interest that you have here, your current level of understanding with this difficult concept, and use ChatGPT as an intelligent tutor. So you can clearly define your current level of understanding, the concept that you're interested in, and then just give it more context. The more context you can give it, the more specific you can be, the better. And I put that example that it gave us back up there in that box. And another tip that I have is remember that it's an iterative process. There's no magic prompt that you can just give it and then it'll just give everything you need. So going back and forth with the bot is the best way to get what you need, usually. So one way you can do that is to ask ChatGPT to evaluate your prompt or to evaluate the prompt that it puts out, to point out and revise potential weaknesses. It's usually able to do that, or to critique the prompt. And or maybe even to ask what further information it needs to help you understand that concept. All right, so we've got, I think, about 5 minutes or so. Take a few minutes, try this out. And in the meantime, feel free to hop on the mic, ask any questions you have, or type them out into the chat, or feel free to share a prompt that you came up with, and maybe how it went, or any questions you have about it. Yes, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Jinjoy. times like this as an instructor, I just wish we could be in the room and I could be like walking around like, hey, what are you working on? It's okay. Sorry. But feel free to share if you're working through things.
Maybe you can type what question you put in the asked it in the chat. It'd be interesting to see what everyone's asking.
Since I came back, I could tell you. So I cheated. I played and then came back. So students have a really hard time with strategic management, strategic planning, and operations management, especially when they come into a nonprofit class versus the for-profit classes. And we use the terms a little bit differently. And so I asked it to do it. My first prompt was compare and contrast strategic management and strategic planning. And so it gave me a whole bunch of stuff, the focus, the scope, flexibility, decision-making, which I thought was really cool that they did this decision-making. Then I said, evaluate your answer. And of course, it kept saying, upon evaluating my previous answer, I find it to be comprehensive and accurate. So it likes to say that response, just an FYI. However, it's important to note that the evaluation of my answer is subjective and based on my own assessment. I then said, how do I better explain this to a 21-year-old college? He said, sure, or it said, sure. Here's a simplified explanation of strategic planning that might be easier for a 21-year-old college student to understand. So it then reevaluated that. I said, what role does operations management play? Gave me a whole bunch of really big terms and whatnot. I said, okay, could you make it so a 19-year-old could understand this? And so then turned around, simplified it, and said, absolutely, here's a simplified explanation of the role of operations management. So a 19-year-old college student can understand it. Then I said, what would be analogies that a college student might help a college student better understand these terms? So it used planning a road trip, building a puzzle, for strategic management, conducting a symphony, playing a game of chess, which I thought were really good. Not bad. But what's fun for me is I use team-based learning, Mike, and everybody else. So I would have the students do this. I would quit and say, okay, what's the next question? Did you understand that? If not, what would you say? And so the teams would then do a competition to find, and I'll say, don't use the first analogy, because the first team I call on, they're going to use that analogy, so.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Annetta, for sharing all of that. Yeah, and what you were just talking about is a great example of the chain prompting technique. So, yeah, so using what we know is best practice as instructors or for our learners is still the subject matter experts, right? Is what we are.
I think it's fun because it teaches them how to use this tool more effectively. This tool is not going to go away. It's just like the internet. How do we teach them to evaluate, critically think about the sites they go to? Did they pass the CRAP test or not? And if they don't pass the CRAP test, well, the ChatGPT is going to be doing that too. I think a lot of us have noticed it's very surface to begin with. So what your chaining is doing is actually getting it more specific, which I like, because I suck at that part myself. So yeah, this is cool.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing.
No problem.
And Robert, thank you as well. And I see what you did in your prompt is you started out with you're a subject matter expert in higher education policy, which is also a great technique for prompting. Tell it to act as a particular role. So that's a good one. There have been some leaks of personal information. Write a statement in official nomenclature. Sometimes you might need to define that for the AI. Oh, okay. We have a warning this time. Good. I have 50 seconds. I included at least 10 rules that are to govern faculty when securing their instructional videos. Yeah. So thanks, Robert, for sharing that. You've got very specific things in there. And you'll find when you test that, you probably have already found it, but when you test a prompt like this, it might not understand particular aspects, especially GPT 3.5 compared to 4. But yes, that's a great example of a prompt that would be a great starting point. So thanks, everyone.
And Mike, thank you for telling us about how to make 3.5 work.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're welcome. And extension, if you want, there it is. Further reading, Ethan Mollick is a great name to follow on LinkedIn if you're looking for more.